It started with a number that didn't make sense. In late 2008, financial analysts, regulators, and even longtime clients began to notice that Bernie Madoff's investment returns were not just good. They were impossibly consistent. While markets swung violently, his portfolios showed steady, predictable growth year after year. In the volatile world of Wall Street, such stability raised one unavoidable question. How was it possible? Bernard Lawrence Madoff was not just another fund manager. Born in 1938 in Queens, New York, he built his reputation from the ground up. In 1960, using $5,000 saved from lifeguarding and installing sprinklers, he founded Bernard L. Madoff Investment Securities. Over the decades, he became a fixture in the financial industry, pioneering electronic trading, serving as chairman of NASDAQ in the early 1990s, and cultivating an image of reliability. Madoff's clientele included hedge funds, charities, celebrities, and wealthy families. His name carried weight and trust. The reality was very different. For years, Madoff was running what would become the largest Ponzi scheme in history. Instead of investing client funds as promised, he used new investors' money to pay returns to earlier ones, creating the illusion of legitimate profit. His operation used a simple but effective cover: account statements printed on outdated dot matrix printers, mailed to clients, showing fake trades and balances. In reality, the trades never occurred. The so-called split strike conversion strategy he described to investors was entirely fabricated. The scheme relied on secrecy. Madoff's investment advisory business operated separately from his legitimate market-making arm. Only a small group of trusted employees, including his brother Peter and a handful of staffers, had access to the 17th floor of his Manhattan offices, where the fraudulent advisory operations were run. There were no independent auditors reviewing the books in any meaningful way, and regulators, despite periodic visits, failed to connect the dots. The global financial crisis of 2008 became the breaking point. As markets collapsed, nervous clients demanded withdrawals totaling billions. For the first time, Madoff could not find enough new money to cover the redemptions. On December 10, 2008, he confessed to his sons, Mark and Andrew, that the investment advisory business was one big lie. The next day, they alerted federal authorities. On December 11th, FBI agents arrested Madoff at his Manhattan penthouse. The investigation uncovered the full scale, approximately $65 billion in stated account balances, though actual investor losses were estimated at around $17 to $20 billion in principal. The list of victims was extensive, from small individual investors to major banks and charitable foundations. Among the most devastated was the Elie Wiesel Foundation for Humanity, which lost nearly all of its assets. Even feeder funds, like those managed by Fairfield Greenwich Group, were revealed to have simply funneled billions to Madoff without adequate oversight. Prosecutors charged Madoff with 11 federal felony counts, including securities fraud, wire fraud, mail fraud, money laundering, perjury, and making false filings with the SEC. The speed of the case was unusual for a white-collar prosecution. In March 2009, Madoff entered a guilty plea, waiving his right to trial. There was no plea bargain. He admitted the fraud had been running for decades, possibly since the early 1990s or earlier. On June 29, 2009, Judge Denny Chin sentenced Madoff to the statutory maximum: 150 years in federal prison. In his remarks, Judge Chin described the fraud as extraordinarily evil, noting the unprecedented scale and the depth of betrayal. Victims filled the courtroom, some delivering statements describing the financial and emotional ruin caused by the collapse. Following sentencing, Madoff was sent to the Federal Correctional Complex in Butner, North Carolina. The Bureau of Prisons assigned him inmate number 61,727-054. There, he worked in the commissary and later in the chapel, reportedly earning $40 a month. His life, once defined by Manhattan penthouses and Palm Beach estates, was reduced to a prison cell and strict routines. The public reaction to the case was intense. Financial regulators faced harsh criticism for missing multiple red flags. whistleblower Harry Markopoulos had filed detailed complaints to the SEC years earlier, outlining why Madoff's returns were mathematically impossible. Those warnings were ignored, leading to congressional hearings and internal reviews. The scandal prompted reforms, including changes to how the SEC investigates investment advisors and how custodians hold client assets. Number 2. Martha Stewart. Martha Helen Stewart had become a symbol of American domestic perfection. Born in New Jersey in 1941, she worked as a model, stockbroker, and later as a caterer before building her empire. By the late 1990s, Martha Stewart Living Omni Media was a powerhouse, a magazine, television shows, books, branded merchandise, and a lifestyle brand synonymous with success and taste. Stewart was not just a celebrity, she was a CEO who had taken her company public in 1999, instantly becoming one of the wealthiest self-made women in the United States. Her reputation was spotless, and her audience trusted her implicitly. In late December 2001, federal regulators were investigating a biotechnology company called ImClone Systems. Its CEO, Samuel Waxall, was a friend of Stewart. ImClone's main product, an experimental cancer drug called Erbitux, was awaiting FDA approval. On December 28, 2001, the Food and Drug Administration announced it had rejected ImClone's application. The company's stock price dropped sharply the next trading day. The issue was what Stewart did before the news became public. On December 27, 2001, one day before the FDA announcement, she sold all 3,928 shares of her ImClone stock, worth roughly $228,000. Investigators later alleged she had acted on a tip from her Merrill Lynch stockbroker, Peter Bakanovich, who had received inside information that Waxall and his family were selling their own shares. This created the appearance that Stewart had avoided significant financial loss by acting on confidential, non-public information. When the Securities and Exchange Commission and the FBI began investigating, Stewart publicly denied wrongdoing. In early 2002, her lawyers stated she had a pre-existing agreement with Bakanovich to sell if the stock fell below $60 per share. The government claimed this explanation was false. Prosecutors accused Stewart not of insider trading directly, but of conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and making false statements to federal investigators. The charges focused on her alleged cover-up rather than the trade itself. The investigation was high-profile from the start. Stewart's case unfolded during a period when corporate scandals like Enron and WorldCom were dominating headlines. Public appetite for accountability in corporate America was intense. Stewart, once celebrated for her precision and control, now faced scrutiny in federal court. Her trial began in January 2004 in U.S. District Court in Manhattan. The prosecution presented phone records, testimony from Bakanovich's assistant, and notes that they claimed documented the tip Stewart received. They argued that she and Bakanovich had fabricated the sell at $60 story after learning of the investigation. The defense countered that there was no clear evidence Stewart knew about Waxall's trades before selling, and that the $60 agreement was genuine. Throughout the trial, Stewart maintained a composed public appearance. Supporters argued that the charges were disproportionate, especially since she was not charged with securities fraud. Critics saw her actions as a violation of trust that demanded consequences. The media covered every development, her courtroom outfits, her demeanor, and her legal team's strategy. On March 5, 2004, the jury returned its verdict. Stewart was found guilty on 4 counts: conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and 2 counts of making false statements to federal investigators. Bakanovich was also convicted. The verdict shocked many of her fans and confirmed her critics' view that even icons were not above the law. On July 16, 2004, Judge Miriam Cederbaum sentenced Stewart to 5 months in federal prison, 5 months of home confinement, and 2 years of supervised release. She was also fined $30,000. The sentence was considered within the low end of federal guidelines, but carried significant personal and professional consequences. In October 2004, Stewart reported to the federal prison camp in Alderson, West Virginia. The facility, nicknamed Camp Cupcake by the press, housed non-violent female offenders. Despite the media's portrayal, life in prison meant early wake-up calls, communal living, and work assignments. Stewart worked in a job supervising the prison's laundry room. She served her sentence without public incident, maintaining contact with her company through her lawyers and carefully chosen communications. Stewart was released from Alderson in March 2005 and immediately began her home confinement phase at her Bedford, New York estate. She wore an electronic ankle monitor and was restricted in her movements until August of that year. Upon completing her sentence, she began the process of rebuilding her brand. The public reaction was divided. Some saw Stewart's case as an example of the government making an example of a celebrity over a relatively small financial matter. Others viewed it as a necessary message that privilege and status would not shield someone from consequences. Her company's stock initially dipped, but later recovered as Stewart resumed television appearances and business ventures. In the years following her release, Stewart regained much of her public presence. She returned to television, launched new product lines, and entered partnerships with major retailers. While her conviction remained a permanent part of her biography, it also became part of her brand's narrative of resilience. The Imclone case left broader ripples in corporate and legal circles. It highlighted the scope of federal powers in pursuing obstruction and false statements, even when the underlying allegation, insider trading, was not formally charged. It also served as a cautionary example for executives and public figures about the consequences of misrepresentation during an investigation. For Stewart, the events of December 2001 marked a sharp turning point. The precision and control that had built her empire could not prevent the consequences of a single decision, and the way it was handled under scrutiny. Her story remains a rare example of a celebrity CEO serving real prison time, and a reminder that reputations built over decades can be challenged in a matter of days. Number 3. Jeffrey Skilling. On the morning of August 14, 2001, Jeffrey Skilling shocked Wall Street when he abruptly resigned as CEO of Enron Corporation after only 6 months in the role. To the public, his departure was framed as a personal decision. Inside the company, it marked the first visible crack in what was about to become one of the most notorious corporate collapses in U.S. history. Jeffrey Keith Skilling was born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania in 1953 and raised in Aurora, Illinois. After earning an MBA from Harvard Business School, he joined McKinsey & Company as a consultant. His work with Enron in the late 1980s led to a permanent role in 1990. He quickly rose through the ranks under CEO Kenneth Lay, championing a transformation of Enron from a traditional pipeline company into a complex energy trading business. Skilling's strategies emphasized aggressive growth, innovative trading in gas and electricity markets, and the heavy use of mark-to-market accounting, a system that allowed Enron to record projected future profits from long-term contracts as current earnings. Under Skilling's influence, Enron's stock price soared through the 1990s. It was named America's Most Innovative Company by Fortune magazine for 6 consecutive years. Analysts praised its business model, and investors trusted the leadership team's claims about profitability and growth. The company expanded into broadband services, weather derivatives, and international energy projects. Behind the scenes, however, Enron's financial statements were supported by a network of off-balance sheet entities known as Special Purpose Entities, SPEs. These partnerships, many run by Chief Financial Officer Andrew Fastow, were used to hide debt and inflate earnings. By mid-2001, warning signs were beginning to emerge. The tech bubble had burst, energy markets were volatile, and Enron's ventures outside core energy trading were underperforming. Internally, executives knew the company was carrying billions in hidden debt, and that its reported earnings did not reflect its true financial health. Skilling's sudden resignation in August 2001 raised suspicions, but he maintained that it was due to personal reasons and stress. Kenneth Lay returned as CEO. In the months following Skilling's departure, the situation unraveled rapidly. Analysts began questioning Enron's opaque financial disclosures. On October 16, 2001, Enron announced a $618 million third-quarter loss and disclosed a $1.2 billion reduction in shareholder equity related to the unwinding of certain partnerships. By early November, the company revealed it would restate its financial statements for the previous 5 years, erasing $586 million in reported profits and acknowledging billions in previously undisclosed debt. The Securities and Exchange Commission launched an investigation into Enron's accounting practices. Credit rating agencies downgraded the company's debt to junk status. On December 2, 2001, Enron filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection, at the time the largest corporate bankruptcy in U.S. history. Thousands of employees lost their jobs and retirement savings, while investors saw tens of billions of dollars in market value vanish. Federal prosecutors began building a case against Enron's leadership, focusing on whether executives knowingly misled investors and regulators. Skilling was indicted in February 2004 on 35 counts, including securities fraud, wire fraud, insider trading, and making false statements. The charges alleged that he conspired with other executives to hide Enron's deteriorating financial condition, artificially inflate earnings, and misrepresent the company's value to investors. The trial of Jeffrey Skilling and Kenneth Lay began in January 2006 in Houston, Texas. The prosecution presented evidence of complex financial structures designed to keep debt off the books and maintain Enron's high stock price. Former executives testified that Skilling was aware of the company's problems and actively participated in the deception. The defense argued that Enron was a legitimate, innovative company undone by a crisis of market confidence and short selling, and that Skilling had no knowledge of any fraud. Midway through the trial, Lay and Skilling both took the stand in their own defense. Skilling denied wrongdoing, insisting that he believed Enron was financially sound when he left. Prosecutors challenged his testimony with internal memos, recorded calls, and emails suggesting he knew the company's earnings reports were misleading. On May 25, 2006, the jury found Skilling guilty on 19 counts of conspiracy, securities fraud, and insider trading, and not guilty on 9 counts of insider trading. Lay was also convicted, though he died of a heart attack before sentencing. On October 23, 2006, Judge Sim Lake sentenced Skilling to 24 years and 4 months in federal prison, one of the longest sentences ever given for white-collar crime at the time. He was also ordered to forfeit $45 million to help compensate victims. Skilling began serving his sentence at the federal prison camp in Montgomery, Alabama. In 2013, after years of appeals and legal negotiations, prosecutors agreed to reduce his sentence by 10 years in exchange for him dropping further appeals and relinquishing more assets to the victims' fund. This deal reduced his prison term to 14 years, and he was transferred to a lower security facility. While in prison, Skilling kept a low profile. Reports indicated he worked in menial jobs and participated in educational programs. His release date was moved forward due to good behavior and completion of a re-entry program. On February 21, 2019, Jeffrey Skilling was released from custody after serving 12 years. The collapse of Enron and Skilling's conviction had lasting consequences. The case prompted the passage of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act in 2002, which imposed stricter corporate governance standards, enhanced financial disclosure requirements, and increased penalties for fraud. Accounting firms faced tighter oversight, and the role of auditors came under renewed scrutiny. public reaction to Skilling's case was shaped by the sheer scale of the damage. Over 20,000 employees lost jobs and retirement savings tied up in Enron stock. Pension funds and small investors were wiped out. The scandal became a symbol of corporate greed and the dangers of unchecked executive power. Jeffrey Skilling's career trajectory, from Harvard-educated consultant to one of the most powerful CEOs in America, then to federal inmate, remains a stark reminder of how corporate ambition, when paired with deceptive practices, can unravel not just companies, but entire lives. His case continues to be studied in business schools and legal circles as an example of the risks and responsibilities of executive leadership, and the catastrophic impact when that trust is broken. Number 4. Leona Helmsley. In the summer of 1989, a Manhattan federal courtroom became the stage for one of the most watched white-collar trials of the decade. At the center sat Leona Helmsley, a billionaire hotel magnate whose empire stretched across New York City and beyond. To her guests, she was the face of luxury. To her employees, she had earned another name, the Queen of Mean. For her temper, exacting standards, and reputation for punishing even small mistakes. Leona Mindy Rosenthal was born in 1920 in Marbletown, New York, and raised in Brooklyn. She began her career in real estate, working for firms that specialized in high-end properties. By the 1960s, she was a successful real estate broker. Her life changed dramatically when she met Harry Helmsley, a powerful New York property developer who owned one of the largest real estate empires in the country. They married in 1972, and together they built a portfolio that included the Helmsley Palace Hotel, the Empire State Building, and dozens of other prestigious properties. The Helmsleys' image was one of wealth and influence. They hosted charity events, appeared in society pages, and were known for living in a 21-room penthouse overlooking Central Park. But behind the public glamour, prosecutors alleged that the Helmsleys had turned their businesses into a personal bank. The case that brought Leona Helmsley to trial centered on a property in Greenwich, Connecticut, Dunellen Hall, a mansion the Helmsleys had purchased and lavishly renovated in the 1980s. The renovations were extensive: marble dance floors, a $1 million swimming pool enclosure, a sound system for the entire estate, and even a mahogany card table. According to the government, many of these expenses, along with bills for clothes, jewelry, and other personal luxuries, were fraudulently charged to their hotel and real estate companies as business expenses. By doing so, the Helmsleys avoided paying federal taxes on millions of dollars of personal spending. In 1988, a grand jury indicted Leona, Harry, and 2 business associates on charges including tax evasion, mail fraud, and conspiracy. Harry Helmsley, in declining health, was deemed unfit to stand trial. The government moved forward against Leona and the others. The trial began in June 1989 in the Southern District of New York. The prosecution's case was built on thousands of invoices, checks, and financial records, as well as testimony from contractors and employees. One of the most damaging pieces of evidence came from a former housekeeper who recalled hearing Leona say, "We don't pay taxes. Only the little people pay taxes." That quote, whether meant seriously or not, became a symbol of the case and was repeated endlessly in news coverage. Prosecutors portrayed Helmsley as a hands-on executive who approved fraudulent billing and pressured subordinates to disguise personal expenses as business costs. The defense countered that she delegated financial matters to staff and was being unfairly targeted because of her wealth and public image. Her lawyers argued that contractors had miscategorized some expenses without her knowledge, and that there was no intent to defraud. Over the course of the trial, witnesses described how the Helmsleys' lavish lifestyle was routinely supported by company funds. From flower arrangements and private jets to luxury clothing and pet care. The jury was shown bills for renovations marked as hotel improvements when the work had been done at Dunellen Hall. On August 30th, 1989, the jury delivered its verdict. Helmsley was convicted on 33 counts, including tax evasion, filing false tax returns, and mail fraud. She was acquitted on some charges, including extortion, but the core of the government's case had been proven. On December 12, 1989, Judge John M. Walker Jr. sentenced Helmsley to 4 years in federal prison, a $7.1 million fine, and 750 hours of community service. In delivering the sentence, the judge noted the need for deterrence, stating that her conduct had shown arrogance and greed. Leona Helmsley began serving her sentence in April 1992 after exhausting appeals. She was assigned to the Federal Correctional Institution in Danbury, Connecticut, a low-security facility for women. There, her life was far from the opulence she was used to. Reports from the time described her working in the prison laundry and cafeteria. After 18 months, she was released to a halfway house in New York and completed her term with 2 additional months of home confinement, serving a total of 19 months behind bars. The case had a lasting impact on her public image. Once known for her business acumen, she became a symbol of the excess and entitlement of the 1980s. The Queen of Mean nickname, originally whispered among employees, became a fixture in tabloid headlines. Late-night comedians and editorial cartoonists turned her trial and the little people quote into cultural shorthand for the divide between the wealthy and ordinary taxpayers. Following her release, Helmsley largely retreated from the public spotlight, but remained active in her business holdings. She continued to oversee elements of the Helmsley empire until her later years, though her involvement was more limited. Her husband, Harry, died in 1997, leaving her the bulk of his fortune, including significant real estate assets. Helmsley died in 2007 at the age of 87. Her will made headlines for unusual bequests, including $12 million left to her dog, Trouble, though a judge later reduced the amount. She also left billions to charity through the Leona M. and Harry B. Helmsley Charitable Trust, which became one of the largest private foundations in the U.S. The Helmsley case remains a defining moment in the history of federal tax enforcement. It demonstrated that prosecutors were willing to pursue high-profile, wealthy defendants, and that tax evasion charges could carry real prison time, even for billionaires. The famous little people remark, whether accurate or misremembered, cemented her as a cautionary example of what happens when corporate resources are abused for personal luxury. In the end, Leona Helmsley's story is one of extremes, a rise from a modest background to controlling an empire worth billions, followed by a very public fall that placed her in the same position as those little people she was accused of dismissing. Her legacy is divided between vast charitable contributions and a criminal conviction that defined the final decades of her life. Number 5. Bernard Ebbers. On June 25, 2002, WorldCom, one of the largest telecommunications companies in the United States, publicly admitted it had overstated its earnings by more than $3.8 billion. The number would soon grow to over $11 billion. Within weeks, the company filed for bankruptcy. The man at the top, Bernard Ebbers, went from celebrated corporate leader to convicted felon in one of the largest accounting scandals in U.S. history. Bernard John Ebbers was born in 1941 in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. He attended college in the United States on a basketball scholarship at Mississippi College. After graduating, he worked as a coach and motel manager before entering the telecommunications business in the early 1980s. In 1983, Ebbers and a small group of investors purchased Long Distance Discount Services, Inc., LDDS, a small Mississippi long-distance provider. Ebbers became CEO in 1985. Over the next 2 decades, Ebbers transformed LDDS into WorldCom through an aggressive acquisition strategy. The company bought dozens of smaller telecom firms, expanding nationwide, and eventually acquiring MCI Communications in 1998 in a $37 billion deal. At its peak, WorldCom was the second largest long-distance telephone company in the United States, with a market capitalization of over $175 billion. Ebbers projected a folksy, self-made image. He was known for his cowboy boots, homespun anecdotes, and preference for driving a pickup truck despite his billionaire status. Investors and analysts viewed him as a visionary who had built an empire from almost nothing. But beneath the image, WorldCom was under immense pressure to meet Wall Street's earnings expectations. By the early 2000s, the telecommunications industry was slowing, competition was increasing, and WorldCom's core business was struggling to maintain growth. Instead of reporting declining profits, executives at WorldCom began using improper accounting methods to hide the company's true financial condition. The fraud centered on the misuse of line cost expenses, the fees WorldCom paid to other telecom companies to use their networks. Normally recorded as an expense, these costs were improperly capitalized, meaning they were listed as long-term investments on the balance sheet. This accounting maneuver falsely inflated profits and allowed WorldCom to meet earnings targets quarter after quarter. In early 2002, the scheme began to unravel. Internal auditor Cynthia Cooper and her team discovered billions in questionable accounting entries. They reported their findings to the board's audit committee. On June 25, 2002, WorldCom announced it had improperly accounted for $3.8 billion in expenses. The figure would later grow to over $11 billion, making it the largest accounting fraud in U.S. history at that time. The fallout was immediate. WorldCom's stock collapsed, wiping out billions in shareholder value. On July 21, 2002, the company filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection, the largest such filing in U.S. history until the 2008 financial crisis. Thousands of employees lost their jobs, and investors lost their savings. Federal prosecutors launched a criminal investigation. In August 2002, Ebbers resigned as CEO under pressure from the board. In March 2004, he was indicted on charges of conspiracy, securities fraud, and filing false reports with regulators. Prosecutors alleged that Ebbers had directed the accounting fraud to conceal WorldCom's declining performance and protect his personal financial interests, which included hundreds of millions in loans secured by his WorldCom stock. Ebbers' trial began in January 2005 in federal court in Manhattan. The prosecution's case relied heavily on testimony from former WorldCom chief financial officer Scott Sullivan, who pleaded guilty and cooperated in exchange for a reduced sentence. Sullivan testified that Ebbers was aware of the improper accounting and pressured executives to hit the numbers demanded by Wall Street. Other witnesses described meetings in which Ebbers allegedly dismissed concerns about the company's financial practices. The defense argued that Ebbers was not an accountant and had relied on his finance team to manage the numbers. His lawyers portrayed him as a visionary businessman who was unaware of the fraud. They suggested Sullivan and others had acted independently to manipulate the books. After 6 weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated for 8 days. On March 15, 2005, Bernard Ebbers was found guilty on all 9 counts, including securities fraud, conspiracy, and filing false documents with regulators. In July 2005, Judge Barbara Jones sentenced him to 25 years in federal prison, one of the harshest sentences ever imposed for a white-collar crime. Ebbers began serving his sentence at the Federal Correctional Institution in Oakdale, Louisiana. His projected release date was 2028, when he would have been in his late 80s. Over the years, his lawyers filed multiple appeals and requests for sentence reductions, arguing that his health was deteriorating. In December 2019, after serving about 13 years, a federal judge granted Ebbers compassionate release due to severe health problems, including dementia and significant weight loss. He was released to the care of his family in Mississippi. Less than 2 months later, on February 2, 2020, Bernard Ebbers died at the age of 78. The WorldCom scandal had lasting consequences. It, along with Enron's collapse, was a driving force behind the Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002, which imposed stricter corporate governance rules, increased penalties for fraudulent financial activity, and strengthened protections for whistleblowers. It also reshaped investor attitudes toward corporate transparency and the role of auditors. For many, Bernard Ebbers' story became a cautionary tale of unchecked expansion, debt-driven growth, and the pressures of meeting market expectations at any cost. The empire he built over 2 decades collapsed in a matter of months, leaving behind one of the largest corporate fraud cases in history, and a reminder of how quickly corporate trust can evaporate when the truth comes out. Number 6. Elizabeth Holmes. In November 2022, Elizabeth Holmes, once hailed as the youngest self-made female billionaire in America, stood before a federal judge in San Jose, California, to hear her sentence, 11 years and 3 months in federal prison. The decision marked the end of a story that began with bold promises of revolutionizing healthcare and ended with one of Silicon Valley's most notorious fraud convictions. Elizabeth Ann Holmes was born in 1984 in Washington, D.C., and raised in Houston, Texas. She attended Stanford University, studying chemical engineering, but dropped out in 2003 at the age of 19 to start a company she named Theranos. The goal was ambitious: to develop a device that could run hundreds of medical tests using just a few drops of blood from a finger prick. Holmes claimed this technology would eliminate the need for traditional blood draws, make testing faster and cheaper, and put the power of diagnostics directly into the hands of patients. Holmes modeled herself after Silicon Valley icons, adopting a black turtleneck wardrobe reminiscent of Steve Jobs, speaking in a deep, measured voice, and projecting an image of absolute confidence. She attracted influential board members, including former U.S. Secretaries of State George Shultz and Henry Kissinger, former Defense Secretary James Mattis, and other high-profile figures. By 2014, Theranos was valued at $9 billion, and Holmes's personal net worth, at least on paper, exceeded $4 billion. Behind the scenes, the technology did not work as claimed. Internal tests repeatedly showed that Theranos' proprietary devices, called Edison machines, produced inaccurate and inconsistent results. Instead of admitting the limitations, Holmes and her president, Ramesh Sunny Balwani, allegedly instructed employees to use commercially available machines from other companies to run many tests, while telling investors, partners, and patients that the results came from Theranos' own technology. In 2015, the Wall Street Journal published an investigation by reporter John Carreyrou that exposed the company's false claims. Former employees described a culture of secrecy and intimidation, where questioning the technology could lead to termination or legal threats. Carreyrou's reporting revealed that Theranos' devices could perform only a fraction of the tests advertised, and often required traditional venous blood draws. The story triggered scrutiny from federal regulators. The Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services found serious deficiencies in Theranos' laboratory operations, including failures that posed immediate jeopardy to patient health and safety. In 2016, CMS revoked the company's license to operate its main lab and banned Holmes from owning or operating a clinical laboratory for 2 years. The Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC, later charged Holmes and Theranos with massive fraud, alleging they had raised more than $700 million from investors by making false statements about the company's technology, business, and revenue prospects. In June 2018, a federal grand jury indicted Holmes and Balwani on multiple counts of wire fraud and conspiracy to commit wire fraud. Prosecutors allege they knowingly misled investors, doctors, and patients to maintain Theranos' valuation and secure funding. Both pleaded not guilty, setting the stage for separate high-profile trials. Holmes' trial began in August 2021 in U.S. District Court in San Jose. The government's case relied on testimony from former employees, investors, and patients, as well as internal documents and emails. Witnesses described how Holmes personally led investor presentations, assuring backers that the technology was validated by major pharmaceutical companies and the U.S. military, claims that were false. Patients testified about receiving alarming and inaccurate test results, including false positives for HIV and incorrect readings for pregnancy and cancer markers. The defense argued that Holmes was a young, inexperienced entrepreneur who believed in her technology and was misled by subordinates, particularly Belwani, whom she accused of controlling behavior and emotional abuse. Prosecutors countered that Holmes had been in charge of Theranos at all times and made the key decisions to hide the technology's flaws. On January 3, 2022, the jury returned its verdict. Holmes was found guilty on 4 counts of fraud, 3 counts of wire fraud against investors, 1 count of conspiracy to commit wire fraud. She was acquitted on 4 counts related to defrauding patients, and the jury could not reach a unanimous decision on 3 other investor-related charges. At her sentencing on November 18, 2022, prosecutors asked for 15 years in prison, while the defense requested a much shorter term, citing her lack of prior criminal history and her role as a new mother. U.S. District Judge Edward Davila sentenced Holmes to 135 months, 11 years and 3 months, in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release. She was also ordered to pay restitution, with the exact amount to be determined. In May 2023, Holmes reported to the federal prison camp in Bryan, Texas, a minimum security facility for women. The Bureau of Prisons assigned her inmate number 24,965-111. While incarcerated, she will be eligible for good conduct time, which could modestly reduce her sentence. Her projected release date, with credit for good behavior, is in late 2032. The Theranos case had far-reaching effects. It sparked renewed scrutiny of Silicon Valley's fake-it-till-you-make-it culture, especially in the health technology sector, where patient safety is at stake. Regulatory agencies examined how startups in heavily regulated industries could attract large investments without sufficient technical validation. The case also underscored the role of investigative journalism in uncovering corporate fraud. For investors, Theranos became a cautionary tale about due diligence and the risks of relying on personal charisma and prestige instead of verified data. For patients, it was a reminder that innovation in healthcare must be balanced by rigorous testing and transparency. Elizabeth Holmes's rise and fall remains one of the most striking in modern corporate history. She built a billion-dollar image on a promise that her company could not fulfill, and when the truth emerged, it dismantled her empire in less than 2 years. Her conviction and sentence placed her alongside the most infamous figures in white-collar crime, not for the size of the financial loss alone, but for the betrayal of trust in a field where accuracy can mean the difference between life and death. Number 7. Dennis Kozlowski. On June 17, 2005, in a Manhattan courtroom, former Tyco International CEO L. Dennis Kozlowski was sentenced to an indeterminate prison term of 8 1/3 to 25 years. The conviction closed one of the most publicized corporate crime cases of the early 2000s, centered on allegations that Kozlowski had treated the multinational conglomerate as his personal bank. Leo Dennis Kozlowski was born in Newark, New Jersey in 1946 and raised in a working-class family. After earning a degree in accounting from Seton Hall University, he joined Tyco International in 1975, a diversified manufacturing and service company headquartered in New Hampshire. Over the next 2 decades, he climbed the corporate ladder, eventually becoming CEO in 1992. Under his leadership, Tyco grew aggressively, acquiring hundreds of companies and expanding into electronics, healthcare, security systems, and industrial products. For much of the 1990s, Kozlowski was praised as a turnaround expert. Tyco's market capitalization surged, and shareholders saw substantial returns. His image was that of a hard-driving executive who delivered results. But behind the scenes, prosecutors later alleged he was using company funds for unauthorized personal benefits worth more than $100 million. The investigation began in 2002 after reports emerged of questionable accounting practices and lavish personal spending charged to Tyco. Prosecutors alleged that Kozlowski, along with Chief Financial Officer Mark Swartz and General Counsel Mark Belnick, had orchestrated an elaborate scheme to take unauthorized bonuses, forgive personal loans from the company, and use corporate funds for luxury items and parties. One of the most notorious examples was a birthday party Kozlowski threw for his wife on the Italian island of Sardinia in 2001. The week-long event cost about $2 million, half of which was allegedly paid for with Tyco funds. Prosecutors presented photographs and video footage of the party, including ice sculptures of Michelangelo's David dispensing vodka and entertainment by Jimmy Buffett. The imagery became a symbol of corporate excess. Another detail that caught public attention was Kozlowski's purchase of a $6,000 shower curtain for his New York apartment, paid for through Tyco. Prosecutors used such items to illustrate what they said was a pattern of looting corporate funds for personal gain. The case against Kozlowski and Swartz alleged that they had awarded themselves more than $150 million in unauthorized bonuses and forgiven over $100 million in company loans, while also benefiting from the sale of inflated Tyco stock. They were charged with grand larceny, conspiracy, securities fraud, and falsifying business records. The first trial in 2004 ended in a mistrial after a juror complained of feeling threatened by public attention. The retrial began in January 2005 in New York State Supreme Court. Over the course of the trial, the prosecution presented financial records, witness testimony, and evidence of extravagant spending. They argued that Kozlowski and Swartz had used their positions to enrich themselves at shareholder expense. The defense claimed that all payments and perks were authorized by Tyco's board of directors and were part of legitimate compensation packages. They argued that the spending, while lavish, was not illegal and that the case was being driven by public outrage over corporate scandals in the wake of Enron and WorldCom. On June 17, 2005, the jury found Kozlowski and Swartz guilty on more than 20 counts each, including grand larceny, conspiracy, and securities fraud. The convictions carried significant prison time, and Judge Michael Obus imposed a sentence of 8 1/3 to 25 years for each man to be served concurrently. Both were also ordered to pay $134 million in restitution and $70 million in fines. Kozlowski began serving his sentence at the Mid-State Correctional Facility in Marcy, New York, before being transferred to the Lincoln Correctional Facility, a minimum security institution in Manhattan. While incarcerated, he participated in work programs and was occasionally interviewed by media outlets. In those interviews, he acknowledged that the spending looked bad, but continued to insist that much of it had been approved by Tyco's board. After serving approximately 6.5 years, Kozlowski was granted parole in January 2014. As part of his release conditions, he was required to continue paying restitution and to avoid any positions that involved control over finances. Upon release, he expressed remorse for the public perception of his actions, stating that he had made mistakes, but denying that he had intentionally committed crimes. The Tyco scandal had long-term consequences for corporate governance. It fueled calls for stricter oversight of executive compensation and stronger internal controls. Shareholder groups cited the case as evidence that boards of directors needed to exercise greater independence and scrutiny over top executives. For the public, the images of Kozlowski's lavish spending, the Sardinia party, the high-priced home furnishings, the multi-million-dollar art purchases, became lasting symbols of early 2000s corporate greed. The $6,000 shower curtain entered popular culture as shorthand for excess at the top of corporate America. Tyco International survived the scandal, but underwent major restructuring, spinning off divisions and changing leadership. The company ultimately relocated its headquarters and focused on its core security and fire protection businesses. The scandal, however, remained a permanent part of its history. L. Dennis Kozlowski's rise and fall remains one of the most cited examples of how quickly corporate prestige can collapse under allegations of financial misconduct. Once celebrated as a skilled builder of a global company, his name is now linked to one of the most notorious white-collar crime cases in New York's history. His case, like those of Enron and WorldCom, helped shape the corporate reform era of the early 21st century, and serves as a cautionary reminder that unchecked executive privilege can lead to both personal and institutional ruin. Number 8. Caroline Ellison. In September 2024, Caroline Ellison, the former chief executive of Alameda Research, stood in a Manhattan federal courtroom to learn her fate. She had already admitted to participating in one of the largest financial frauds in U.S. history, a scheme tied to the collapse of cryptocurrency exchange FTX, and had spent nearly 2 years cooperating with prosecutors. Her sentence, 2 years in federal prison, reflected both the gravity of the crime and the weight her testimony carried in securing the conviction of FTX founder Sam Bankman-Fried. Caroline Ellison was born in 1994 and grew up in Newton, Massachusetts, in an academically accomplished family. She studied mathematics at Stanford University, graduating in 2016. That same year, she joined Jane Street, a quantitative trading firm, where she met Sam Bankman-Fried. 2 years later, she left Jane Street to work at Alameda Research, a cryptocurrency trading firm Bankman-Fried had founded in 2017. Alameda specialized in high-volume digital asset trading, arbitrage, and investing in blockchain projects. By 2021, Ellison had become Alameda's co-CEO and later its sole CEO. Alameda was closely linked to FTX, the crypto exchange founded by Bankman-Fried in 2019. The two companies were supposed to operate independently, but prosecutors later showed they were deeply intertwined, financially, operationally, and personally. Alameda had special access to FTX customer funds and trading privileges that no other firm enjoyed. At its peak, FTX was valued at $32 billion and promoted as a safe, regulated place for everyday investors to trade digital assets. It secured high-profile endorsements, ran Super Bowl ads, and signed sports arena naming rights deals. But in reality, FTX and Alameda were operating with massive financial holes, using customer deposits to cover risky bets, political donations, and luxury expenses. In November 2022, a report by crypto news outlet CoinDesk revealed that much of Alameda's balance sheet was made up of FTT, a cryptocurrency issued by FTX itself. This raised questions about the company's liquidity. Within days, rival exchange Binance announced it would sell its FTT holdings, sparking a market panic. FTX customers began withdrawing funds en masse. In less than a week, the exchange was insolvent. On November 11, 2022, FTX and Alameda filed for bankruptcy. The collapse exposed an $8 billion shortfall in FTX customer funds. Prosecutors alleged that Bankman-Fried had directed Ellison and others to misappropriate billions from FTX customers and use the money to repay Alameda's lenders, make political contributions, fund venture investments, and cover losses from high-risk trading. On December 18, 2022, Ellison pleaded guilty in the Southern District of New York to 7 counts. Conspiracy to commit wire fraud on FTX customers, conspiracy to commit wire fraud on Alameda's lenders, conspiracy to commit commodities fraud, conspiracy to commit securities fraud, and conspiracy to commit money laundering. As part of her plea agreement, she admitted that she knew her actions were wrong and that she had acted at the direction of Bankman-Fried. Her cooperation agreement required her to testify truthfully in related prosecutions. In October 2023, during Bankman-Fried's criminal trial, Ellison was a key witness for the prosecution. Over several days of testimony, she described how she, Bankman-Fried, and other executives conspired to use FTX customer deposits to repay Alameda's debts and fund its investments. She explained the mechanisms they used to conceal the shortfall, including misleading balance sheets sent to lenders. Ellison's testimony was backed by internal documents, encrypted messages, and other witness accounts. She admitted to signing false financial statements and acknowledged that Alameda's special privileges on FTX, such as an unlimited line of credit and exemption from liquidation rules, were hidden from customers and most employees. Her account directly contradicted Bankman-Fried's defense that she was solely responsible for Alameda's losses. Prosecutors credited Ellison's cooperation as extraordinary and said it was instrumental in securing Bankman-Fried's conviction on all counts in November 2023. In sentencing memoranda, they acknowledged her early guilty plea, her detailed testimony, and her efforts to assist in asset recovery. At her own sentencing in September 2024, U.S. District Judge Lewis Kaplan weighed the scale of the crime against her cooperation. He noted that Ellison had helped to facilitate a fraud that caused massive losses to thousands of customers worldwide, but also recognized that without her testimony, the case against Bankman-Fried might have been significantly harder to prove. He imposed a 2-year prison term, far below the statutory maximum, followed by 3 years of supervised release. Ellison was ordered to surrender to the Bureau of Prisons in late 2024 to begin serving her sentence at a low-security facility. She also faces potential restitution obligations, though the exact amount remains subject to ongoing bankruptcy and asset recovery proceedings. The FTX collapse sent shockwaves through the cryptocurrency industry, triggering renewed calls for regulation, stricter oversight of exchanges, and clearer separation between customer funds and corporate assets. Lawmakers cited the case as evidence that the crypto sector's rapid growth had outpaced its safeguards, leaving investors vulnerable to misconduct at the highest levels. For many, Ellison's story became a symbol of how quickly young executives could rise in the volatile crypto market, and how swiftly it could all unravel. Her transition from Stanford graduate to CEO of a multi-billion-dollar firm, then to federal inmate, mirrored the rapid boom and bust of the digital asset world itself. In the broader history of financial crime, her case stands out for its combination of cutting-edge technology, old-fashioned embezzlement, and the collapse of a carefully cultivated public image. By cooperating, she avoided what could have been a decades-long prison term, but the conviction ensures her name will remain permanently tied to one of the largest frauds in modern finance. Number 9. Jordan Belfort. In 2003, Jordan Belfort, once the high-profile founder and CEO of Long Island brokerage firm Stratton Oakmont, stood before a federal judge to be sentenced for securities fraud and money laundering. His fall ended years of aggressive pump-and-dump schemes that had defrauded more than 1,500 investors of roughly $200 million, making him one of the most notorious figures in U.S. financial crime. Jordan Ross Belfort was born in 1962 in the Bronx, New York, and raised in Queens. After graduating from American University with a degree in biology, he briefly attended dental school before leaving, deciding the profession wasn't for him. He worked various sales jobs before entering the stockbroker business in the late 1980s. In 1989, Belfort founded Stratton Oakmont in Lake Success, New York, with partner Danny Porush. Stratton Oakmont operated as a so-called boiler room, a brokerage that relied on aggressive, high-pressure cold calling to sell speculative stocks. The firm specialized in underwriting initial public offerings, IPOs, of small companies, then using aggressive sales tactics to inflate their share prices. Once the price reached artificially high levels, firm insiders and favored clients would sell their shares, reaping large profits. The price would collapse, leaving ordinary investors with substantial losses. This method, known as a pump and dump scheme, was illegal under federal securities laws. At its peak in the mid-1990s, Stratton Oakmont employed more than 1,000 brokers and was responsible for selling over $1 billion worth of stock. The firm projected an image of success, expensive offices, lavish events, and extravagant perks for top producers. Belfort himself lived in a sprawling Long Island mansion, drove luxury cars, and hosted elaborate parties. His lifestyle was fueled by the firm's illicit profits and a culture that rewarded aggressive sales at any cost. The National Association of Securities Dealers, NASD, now FINRA, began investigating Stratton Oakmont in the early 1990s for repeated violations of securities regulations. Between 1989 and 1996, the firm faced numerous disciplinary actions, including fines and trading suspensions. In December 1996, the NASD expelled Stratton Oakmont from the securities industry, effectively shutting it down. Federal prosecutors built a criminal case against Belfort, Porish, and other firm executives, alleging that they had orchestrated a years-long conspiracy to defraud investors. The indictment detailed how Stratton Oakmont used deceptive sales scripts, falsified account statements, and secret agreements to manipulate stock prices and conceal their trading activities. In 1999, Belfort was formally charged with securities fraud and money laundering. Facing decades in prison if convicted at trial, he agreed to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence. His cooperation included providing information on other financial crimes and testifying against former associates. In 2003, U.S. District Judge Leonard Wexler sentenced Belfort to 4 years in federal prison and ordered him to pay $110.4 million in restitution to the defrauded investors. He ultimately served 22 months at the Taft Correctional Institution in California before being released in 2006 to a halfway house. While incarcerated, Belfort began writing his memoir, The Wolf of Wall Street, detailing his rise and fall in the financial industry. The book, published in 2007, later became the basis for the 2013 Martin Scorsese film starring Leonardo DiCaprio. The film's portrayal of Stratton Oakmont's excesses brought renewed attention to the case, but also generated criticism from some victims who felt it glamorized the crimes. Following his release, Belfort transitioned into a career as a motivational speaker and sales trainer. He has maintained that he has worked to repay victims, though federal prosecutors have stated that he has paid back only a fraction of the $110 million ordered by the court. In 2018, the U.S. government claimed Belfort still owed more than $100 million in restitution. The Stratton Oakmont case remains a textbook example of large-scale securities fraud in the retail brokerage industry. It highlighted the vulnerabilities in the IPO market for small-cap stocks and the need for tighter regulation and enforcement. FINRA and the SEC increased oversight of brokerage firms, strengthened rules on sales practices, and imposed stricter penalties for market manipulation. For investors, the case served as a reminder of the dangers of high-pressure sales tactics and the importance of due diligence. Many victims of Stratton Oakmont were individual investors persuaded to buy into speculative companies with promises of rapid gains. When the schemes collapsed, their investments were nearly worthless. Jordan Belfort's personal story, from a modest upbringing to enormous wealth, then to federal prison, remains one of the most high-profile cautionary tales in white-collar crime. His transformation into a public speaker has been controversial, with critics arguing that he continues to profit from the notoriety of his crimes. Supporters contend that his openness about his past serves as a warning to others. In the end, Belfort's legacy is inseparable from Stratton Oakmont's collapse and the harm inflicted on thousands of investors. The name Wolf of Wall Street, originally used by prosecutors to describe his aggressive and predatory tactics, has become part of popular culture. But for those who lost their savings, it represents one of the most damaging brokerage frauds of the late 20th century. Number 10. Johanna Garcia. In December 2024, Johanna M. Garcia, the founder and CEO of MJ Capital Funding, LLC, stood in a Florida federal courtroom to receive her sentence, 20 years in federal prison. Prosecutors described her as the architect of a $190 million Ponzi scheme that defrauded thousands of investors, many of whom were ordinary people in South Florida's Hispanic community. Despite cultivating an image as a philanthropist and community helper, some victims even called her Mother Teresa, her business was, in reality, a massive fraud. Garcia founded MJ Capital Funding in 2020 in Pompano Beach, Florida. The company's stated business model was merchant cash advances, short-term financing provided to small businesses in exchange for a percentage of future sales. Investors were told their money would be used to fund these advances, generating profits that would be shared with them. Promotional materials promised annual returns of up to 120%, with the claim that the investment was safe and backed by legitimate lending operations. The company targeted investors through social media, community events, and word-of-mouth referrals. Garcia's approachable image, fluent Spanish, and frequent appearances at local charitable events helped her win trust. She sponsored sports teams, hosted giveaways, and posed for photos with community leaders. For many, she appeared to be a rare business leader who was both successful and generous. In reality, according to court records, MJ Capital Funding had little to no legitimate revenue from merchant cash advances. Instead, Garcia and her associates used funds from new investors to pay earlier investors, a classic Ponzi scheme structure. By keeping up the illusion of regular interest payments, she encouraged reinvestment and attracted more participants. Prosecutors said she also used investor money for personal expenses, including luxury items, travel, and real estate purchases. The scheme grew quickly. By mid-2021, MJ Capital Funding had raised over $190 million from more than 9,000 investors across the United States, though the majority were concentrated in South Florida. Investors were often persuaded by friends or family members who had already received early returns and believed the business was genuine. In August 2021, the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission filed a civil complaint against Garcia and her company, accusing them of operating a Ponzi scheme. The complaint outlined how MJ Capital Funding made virtually no legitimate loans and instead relied on continuous fundraising to pay returns. The SEC obtained an emergency asset freeze, and a receiver was appointed to take control of the company's operations. Federal prosecutors later filed criminal charges, including wire fraud and conspiracy to commit wire fraud. The indictment alleged that Garcia knowingly misrepresented the company's operations, fabricated loan documentation, and provided false information to investors about the source of their returns. Several co-conspirators were also charged, accused of acting as recruiters and knowingly helping to perpetuate the fraud. Faced with overwhelming evidence, including bank records, investor statements, and testimony from former employees, Garcia pleaded guilty in September 2024. In her plea agreement, she admitted that the majority of funds raised were never used for merchant cash advances, and that the supposed profits paid to investors came from other investors' principal contributions. At her sentencing in December 2024, prosecutors emphasized the scale of the damage. Thousands of victims had lost their life savings, retirement funds, and college tuition money. Many were immigrants or first-generation Americans with limited investment experience who trusted Garcia because she was part of their community. Victim statements read in court described feelings of betrayal and financial devastation. Prosecutors requested a lengthy prison term, citing the size of the fraud, the number of victims, and Garcia's role as the scheme's leader. The defense sought leniency, pointing to her lack of prior criminal history and the argument that she had once intended to operate a legitimate business. Judge Rog Singal, presiding in the Southern District of Florida, sided with the prosecution's call for a strong sentence, imposing 240 months in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release. Garcia was also ordered to pay restitution, though the amount each victim will recover will depend on the liquidation of remaining assets and the receiver's recovery efforts. The MJ Capital funding case drew comparisons to other South Florida Ponzi schemes, a region with a long history of similar frauds. It underscored how affinity fraud, scams that target members of a specific community, often based on shared language, culture, or religion, can be especially damaging. Victims not only lose money, but also trust in community institutions and leaders. Following the sentencing, the U.S. Attorney's Office and the SEC both issued public statements warning potential investors to be cautious of high-return, low-risk promises, especially from unregulated entities. The receiver for MJ Capital Funding continues to pursue clawback lawsuits against early investors and recruiters who profited from the scheme in an effort to redistribute recovered funds to net losers. Garcia's conviction closes one chapter of the case, but for many victims, the financial and emotional losses will last for years. Some have formed support groups to share information about the recovery process, while others have returned to working multiple jobs to rebuild savings. The sense of betrayal is especially acute among those who saw Garcia as a role model and community benefactor. Johanna Garcia's rise and fall, from celebrated businesswoman to convicted fraudster, is a stark reminder of how easily trust can be exploited when appearances align with community pride. The title Mother Teresa that once reflected admiration now serves as bitter irony for those left in the wake of her deception. Her 20-year sentence places her among the longest-serving female white-collar offenders in recent U.S. history, a reflection of the unprecedented scale of the scheme and the number of lives it damaged. And that brings us to the end of today's video. If you've stayed with me all the way through, go ahead and hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next upload. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and which story stood out to you the most. Thanks for tuning in, take care of yourselves, and I'll see you in the next one.